Hey everybody, I'm coming to you today from this beautiful and wild canyon country here in Utah. Uh, and I wanted to talk a little bit today. This is a perfect setting for it to talk about public lands. Now, I'm also going to touch on the idea of why we as nomads and people living on the road would gravitate so much to the western US. And in our case, we do most of our nomadic travel a lot in the United States, good deal just basically in North America. We can't really easily get beyond North America at this point without, shipping our car or something crazy like that. Not in the budget. But the point is we travel in North America, and a lot of that ends up being in the United States. So that's what today's discussion is focused on. So I'm not really talking about anywhere else, but in terms of this country, our public lands are an interesting topic to discuss. Now, like I said, as being living in your SUV living or van life, or if you're in a truck camper, RV, whatever, it just makes more sense to do that travel and living out west. And a big part of that reason is totally tied to the public lands picture. If you are from the East Coast and you're watching this, I encourage you to do a little research and check it out. And I'm going to talk about it today because it's a really interesting picture. Just simply looking at a map summarizes the picture for you. I'll put one up here so you can check it out and see what I'm talking about. Look at the picture and see clearly it jumps out at you right away that the West has a lot more public lands. There are data tables you can look at for different years. And there was a recent one published, I think it was published 2020, but it's off of 2018 data. I'll stick the link below if you're interested, if you're like me and you like to look at those numbers and analyze it. It puts all the states in order of their public lands and what's really interesting is to look at the percent of the state that is public lands. Now, this is further categorized into a lot of different designations. We have Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, game reserves, and even I think Department of Defense, something's in there too that's considered public land. So you break down the categories, and I will say that the public lands are really important to me because there's different ways we could have public access to land. However, in all fairness, today, the society we have, the only real expression of freedom, physical freedom to walk around, is within our designated public lands. That's just the way it is. And as much as I have a lot of quarrels with the way we handle some of our public lands, what we do with them, what they're used for, how they're treated, that's a whole nother story and topic to talk about. It's a very fair and useful conversation. Regardless of that, let me put that aside and on the shelf for now. Regardless of that, the public lands are still pretty special places because in our society today, it's literally, like I said, our expression of freedom to walk around and freedom to feel this like openness and be in a space that doesn't have tons of human infrastructure all around. There's no sidewalks. I can just walk on the land and I can see the plants and I can forage and I can look at the rocks and this is exercise. It's good for our health physically and mentally. So it's really important for us to have these. And if you start digging and researching into culture, a lot of the Western culture is built around this. A lot of people are, big into hiking and stuff like that. So it's definitely affects us. But yeah, there's special places. And yeah, from the nomad perspective, really important because if you want to be nomadic and go from place to live and sleep and camp, you pretty much need public lands. You're obviously not going to be able to do this on private lands. So we need public lands for this and all the other things that I just mentioned that make them important. So what's interesting is I just want to point out a few things with that data that I was talking about. I scanned it, and pretty much the biggest trends that stuck out to me that were interesting were, first off, if you look at the list, percent based, the percent of that state that is public lands, you immediately see it's pretty much the western states. They have some of the biggest percentages. Nevada is huge on public lands. They have lots of it. California has a decent amount. It's up there. Arizona's in there. Idaho's up there on the list. That was a pretty good state for public lands. Washington's decent. These are all the top contenders. Who'd I miss? Like Wyoming's up there. Colorado's in there. It's not the highest of the West, but it's in there. Utah is very high on the list, and that explains why I like places like Utah and those other states, and like exploring them, because I can. So that is the one obvious trend. It's big time western states for public lands. And then when you kind of get through those western states, what's next? Well, it was interesting that Florida and New York, well, New York and Florida in that order, I think, if I remember correctly, are the next like non-western states that you start seeing on that list. Pretty interesting, huh? Way to go. So there's still, I guess, some places. Now, I'm not terribly familiar with New York. I lived in Pennsylvania. So I did quite a bit in that state, but only a little bit in New York. So if anyone's watching from New York, I don't know what you guys have. Do you have national forest land? I didn't look at the breakdown on there. But yeah, it is interesting to see the breakdown and sort of observe what it means, because that's the next thing, is the definition of public lands. It varies. So the quality of the public lands might vary as well for these different states. But I can speak for the West, because we've pretty much been living in the West for years now in our nomadic travels, and the public land quality in terms of what kind of land. I mean, this is BLM, Forest Service. This is stuff that you can really get out on and explore. Great if you're living on the road and you need places to park and camp for free. And that's why this is possible, because we don't even have to pay for camping. I know some people still do. They go to campgrounds, whatever, if they want facilities and stuff like that. But there is plenty of land out west at this point that's designated public, and myriad of roads that you can get lost on. So you can camp for free out west. So again, if you're an East Coaster and you're not very familiar, if you haven't really got to see these public land settings out west, just know that it is possible. And what we're doing is possible a big time because of public access to the land. And these are cool areas too on top of it. I mean, this is canyon country here. Mountains, snow-capped mountains, all kinds of ecosystems that you can explore. So yeah, if you're camping and traveling, that's possible. And then if you're on foot, it gets even more interesting, because in terms of surface area, there's endless places you can walk out here. And it's a playground for those of us that love the outdoors. And I know that we need it. We need the outdoors. So it actually is a very important topic for us socially, politically. And then if you go down that list, and this is where it gets interesting, you start looking at some of the other states, you'll start to see that places like Texas is really low on the list. And Texas isn't small. Now, I know this is percent based, so the size doesn't necessarily matter. But, you know, it's kind of sad that Texas is so small on that list. So they have... Oh, I forget. I looked at the change over the years, so like 91, 95, and 2018 data. So I could see the change, and Texas was in the range of like 1 to 3%, I think, within those periods. So it's going down in every place. Well, pretty much every place, inevitably. But Texas is a huge state, and only a very, very small percent of it is public lands. And that explains why we did a video before. We had a tough time in Texas on the public lands because it was far and few between. So that one's low. Places like Indiana and Illinois are pretty low on the list. And the real low guys are Kansas and Iowa. Iowa's really low. I think it was 0.3% of the state is public lands. And Kansas is really low, like I said. Nebraska's rather low. So those states are a lot of privately owned. I mean, you're a city, you're a suburb, or you are a lot of it's feedlots and stuff like that. So that's not good for people people need to be able to have access to land to actually get out and explore. And then on top of it, it's really not good for wildlife, obviously. If they're not on public land, then privately a lot of stuff can happen to the wildlife, and it does. These trends you can see culturally and what spills over into these states. So, really interesting point for multiple reasons I wanted to bring up today. But one, if you're a nomad or you want to live on the road, and if you are coming from an East Coast setting, you may not be familiar. Public lands are awesome. Two, looking at those trends is really interesting and thinking about how that affects us and the way that we grow up and things like that. Three, also thinking about the future and how that public land access is changing. And it is changing, and it goes down often. And if you look, again, I'll post the links. I'll post the 91, 95, and 2018 data links that I researched, and you can look at them too. I have not plugged them in, but if anyone really wants to play with data, you could probably copy that and put it in Excel, or maybe there's another source out there. But you could look at the changes in the percent of public land and see how that's changing. But just a quick glance, it's pretty obvious, and common sense tells you it's going to go down over time. That's not a trend that we want. Per all the benefits I just talked about of our sense of freedom, our freedom to be able to roam the land, that's our only chance in this current society, is if we have public lands. The only time we really had this before, you'd have to go back to certain native groups that could actually roam the land freely and didn't really have private ownership. Nowadays, it's the only option is really to do it on what we designate as public land. So that makes them really important for us to keep and obviously to take care of too. So those of us that go on to them, just really thinking of them that way and cherishing them would be really important, because they get treated bad at all levels in many cases, and we really need to treat them better. And we really need to, if we do have the chance to vote and have a voice, we need to keep public lands, because selling it off, I mean, even from federal public lands are some of the best ones that you can really get out there on. State has a lot more payments associated with it, I've found, and that's why I've kind of been deterred from state lands. State usually has a fee, and state usually has then camping fees, and it's not as free to roam as a lot of the federal lands are. So federal sells it off to state, and then state parses it off to private, and then eventually gets in private hands, and it either turns into a suburb, a city, a development, a company's allotted land for whatever they're doing with it, mineral extraction, whatever. But once it gets in those hands of private, some chance it's coming back to public. So if we give that up, that's not going to be good for us physically and mentally, for our health, because we need freedom to roam. This is so precious. So something to think about for you guys that like the nomadic idea and like our sense of freedom and care about our freedoms. If we don't have freedom to roam, I don't think we'd be free. So that's my thoughts for today, guys. I'm going to go for a long hike and see where I can get lost in these canyons today, because I love canyon country. It's so awesome. It's just a wonderful place to be in. I have such a nice weather day. So that's my plan. We'll have a lot more coming down the line. I hope you guys are enjoying your time, and I hope you get a chance to enjoy some of these Western public lands when possible. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye, everybody.